I'm Andrew Hill. I'm the management editor of the Financial Times, but I frequently write about leadership as well. As many people in this room know, Peter Drucker famously said that one doesn't manage people in the society of knowledge workers, one leads people. And like Julia, I have a James March quotation as well. He said that leadership involves poetry as well as plumbing, one of my favorite management quotations. So we're going to talk a bit about the poetry and a little bit about the plumbing, I hope, and we're going to do so with the help of practitioners, teachers, and those who've experienced both sides of the management leadership question. A couple of other things I just wanted to throw in, which I picked up during the last day and a half. Yesterday, when Gary Hamill was talking about Morningstar, a company that's come up in a number of sessions I know, he said people often asked him whether that was a company with no managers. And in fact, he said it's about everyone being a manager. And this morning, Bill Fisher of IMD was talking about what's needed in order to liberate people to change the practice of management. And I was interested in the sort of paradox that he identified of the need for assured, courageous, top-down leaders who are comfortable enough in their roles to liberate people to achieve more, and indeed to themselves step back from micromanaging their people. So those were some provocative thoughts that I think have already come out that I hope we will help feed into this session. We're going to start with two short keynotes. I've asked each of the keynote speakers to give us no more than 10 minutes each. And who better to start that off than Herminia Ibarra. She has leadership in her title and also leader in the title of her new book, which is coming out shortly. So Herminia, please get us started.
Okay. All right, good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to start with a disclaimer relative to yesterday's discussion. I have no Austrian ancestry whatsoever. None. However, as a native Cuban and longtime French resident, I have plenty of experience with antiquated management systems. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the problems with the way we think about management and leadership, and then hopefully some of the things that, that we can do about it. And I'm going to start with a confession and an observation. And the confession is this, and I actually wondered whether I'd share this story, but the interesting thing is I have found that many of us who have the word leadership in our titles and who teach leadership and who write about leadership feel a little bit sheepish about it. And I realize this because we, at my institution, INSEAD, we hold a leadership research conference every year, one of those few rare events where we invite only academics, no practitioners. And the facilitators was about 2 years ago, and we do this jointly with Wharton and Duke and Erasmus. And one of my colleagues who was facilitating the discussion asked us, how many of you identify yourself as a leadership researcher? And it turned out that very few people raised their hands. And that's a sad state of affairs. I mean, the reason for it was because in certain academic circles, the term has been devalued as something that is associated with either lesser publications or looser scholarship. And what happens is then we do not set ourselves up to affect practice. And so I found that was interesting. The other observation that I wanted to share is a lot of business schools have been going through curriculum reviews in the past few years, trying to update what we teach in order to bring the MBA closer to the 21st century. And an interesting thing there is that in almost every kind of reform, there's been an effort to bring more leadership into the curriculum for MBA students. But when you look at what form that takes, it's not organizational leadership, it's personal leadership. How do you understand yourself better? How do you diagnose yourself? How do you become a more authentic leader? How do you communicate better? How do you manage your own career? But very little of what used to be the mainstay when I started my career, which were things like organization design, organizational change, things that had to do with big systems. And so I just thought I'd throw out those conversations to kind of frame our discussion. Because I think all of us would agree that, you know, the charismatic leader has been really kind of the dominant image of leadership that we have played with, and that is often very problematic. A great example is, just recently in the news, is Bill Gross of PIMCO, if we could get the slide started. So Bill Gross, charismatic, eccentric, unique, very much the face of PIMCO, way past solid performance. Once he goes off to Janus, all of a sudden PIMCO has a very different face, a much more team-centric, kind of steady. We're the steady stewards. We're the team. We're not these wild and crazy, volatile individuals. And you see this kind of ping-pong back and forth. If you just look at the news, there's story after story of CEO, very individualistic, very charismatic, very visible, gets into trouble, and often Sanofi's Weibacher is a great recent example. He was very much hired for his take charge, top-down, individualistic leadership, but was ousted just very recently for two things that were cited: spotty execution and an individualistic rather than collective kind of style. So we see these examples over and over again. The thing is, you know, our collective imagination has no real alternative to the heroic leader. You know, it's not the efficient administrator. That's always the bad guy. And everywhere you look in any kind of media or press, what you get are images. This is a, sorry, this should have gone back one. Oh. Whoops, I'm missing my image. Anyway, I'll tell you what the image was. A couple years ago, I was in and out of Zurich Airport all of the time, and there was this wonderful billboard, a publicity for IWF watches, and it said, "Engineered for the man who doesn't need a co-pilot." Every time I walked into Zurich Airport, that's what I saw. You know, the collaborative leader doesn't sell deodorant, doesn't sell perfume. That's just really not the image that we hold. And, you know, just to cite a different example that caught my eye, this comes from a blog by Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz. And he wrote this blog called Peacetime CEO, Wartime CEO, when Larry Page took over at Google. And he said, Eric Schmidt was your classic peacetime CEO. Market is good, things are good. We can be collaborative. We can tolerate divergence. We can tolerate individuality and creativity. Now it's war, because our market position is no longer assured. Now it's peacetime, and now what we need to do is singular focus, no deviation. You can't read this, but it's actually quite funny. Peacetime CEO focuses on the big picture and empowers her people to make detailed decisions. Wartime CEO cares about a speck of dust on a gnat's ass if it interferes with the prime directive, right? Peacetime CEO sets big, hairy, audacious goals. Wartime CEO is too busy fighting the enemy to read management books written by consultants who have never managed a fruit stand. Just a few examples. But that is an enduring image. It's an enduring image. When things are tough, you need a firm and steady hand. Oh, here's my ad, right? When things are tough, you need a firm and steady stand. Except, you know what? We have another theory, too, that I have heard a lot recently, which is in this VUCA world of today, we need the diverse voices. The thing is, we don't know. we don't know which of the two it is. And so there's been this kind of pendulum in how we think about management and leadership that kind of swings from the heroic and the individual to the collective and the collaborative. It's hard to tell which way it's going. One thing that I found interesting was in Just this last month, HBR put out a list of the top performing CEOs in terms of very traditional metrics, but kind of taking a look at them long term. And one of the things the article really focused on is the rise of the engineer CEO. 24 out of the 100 were engineers, and it was kind of praised. You know, I had seen words like this in a management journal for a while, praising them for their efficiency and their ability to bring kind of nuts and bolts thinking to organizations. In fact, the article cited headhunter James Citron saying, engineers excel at architectural thinking and logical problem solving. Now, I thought this is kind of different. And part of what was interesting in those data is that, particularly when it came from outsider CEOs, a higher proportion of outsider CEOs were engineers than other things. And so it seemed to be that the fact of having this background was reassuring to boards who really wanted a steady hand on the till. So that sounded a little bit different. So I was thinking about the history of leadership thought and where it comes from and how it's evolved. And it really did start with the individual and what were called the great man theories at kind of the turn of the century. And from there, it took actually quite a long while before we started thinking in a very systematic way about organizations and systems. We got to situational leadership in the 60s, which is something we still think a lot about today, except it's not as simple. And the idea was that you need different kinds of leaders and different kinds of managers for different kinds of organizations. If they're big like Whirlpool, you got to have more process and systems in place. And if they're small and collaborative and collegial, the knowledge organizations that Peter Drucker talked about, you need a different kind of leadership. Now, what happened was things got more complicated because organizations started to really be hybrids of both different kinds. And so this idea devolved into what we often talk about today as the difference between management and leadership. Management is about the tasks and the systems and the processes and efficiency, and leadership is about change and inspiration, right? Now, just looking at that picture, which one do you want to be? Right? Which one do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind of the boring manager in charge of bureaucracy, or do you want to be the exciting, inspirational leader that's charismatic and is all about the change? And so people get that. people get that. And we've seen even more of that kind of thinking coming out of the startups in Silicon Valley, kind of a new wave of firms that basically says this stuff is not useful. It's not motivating. It's constraining. And one thing that also very much caught my eye, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a presentation by Netflix that kind of made the rounds, apparently got viewed more than 5 million times, about how they manage talent. Just a very simple presentation. And they talked about how they have basically done away with all the basics, like performance appraisal interviews, like vacation policies. And they basically said none of the options that we can see out there are good. We can stay small and not scale. We can get big and not manage it, but it's going to be chaos. We can use process, but it's going to stifle creativity. And the solution they came up with was to focus very exclusively on only hiring and retaining what they call A-level talent. But that's a very hard thing to do in a legacy organization. That's a very hard thing to do, perhaps in many countries in Europe. It's really not all that transferable. What do you do otherwise? David Brooks just recently had an article. He's talking about the Ebola epidemic and how bad we've been at really tackling it well and systemically. But what he said really gets to the heart of this problem, which is we do not love the organization man anymore. We are no longer comfortable with these large systems. We don't find it prestigious to be in charge of them. What we want is disruption and creativity, but what he said, what happens is, as a result of this, is we're getting infrastructure decay. What are we going to do about that? As I was thinking about this, I just by serendipity, I ran across this wonderful article by some colleagues of mine at UCLA and Columbia. And they were really interested in what they call the managerial mystique, what makes people be seen as charismatic leaders when they're successful. And they were inspired by the movie Amadeus about Mozart, a scene in there where Mozart, as a young child, basically improvises a brilliant sonata on the spot after Salieri, his rival, has been working and toiling to kind of cobble something together that it really isn't nearly as good. And the point that they wanted to make, that they showed in a series of quite rigorous studies, is that when we see people who are successful and we don't see visible causes like hard work and procedure and rules, we attribute all kinds of mystical qualities to them that actually make them quite attractive, that makes us want to follow them. Nobody wanted to follow the leaders and managers who got their success by hard work. It just wasn't fun. It wasn't as inspirational. And just kind of to make the point, one of my colleagues at INSEAD, Jean-François Mazzoni, polls his senior managers that he teaches about how they spend their time. And he gives them 4 choices. Do you spend your time doing stuff? Do you spend your time mobilizing people? Do you spend your time strategizing? And do you spend your time architecting systems? Well, they spend most of their time, well, what do you think they spend most of their time doing? They spend most of their time doing. They do a good bit of mobilizing interpersonally and through inspirational speaking. They don't do enough strategizing, and they're aware of that. They're aware of that. But they do even less architecting, and they're not aware that they should be doing more of it. It's not even on their radar screen. Now, whose fault is that? Well, in part, it's our fault. In business schools and in research, this is a kind of a thing I've been thinking about recently. We're teaching authentic leadership. We're teaching people how to channel their inner resources in their inner selves, and not necessarily helping them think about how do they do the hard work of changing some of these antiquated processes and systems. And incidentally, this is a chart that shows how often we see the word authenticity in headlines in leading business media. Well, it's been on the rise, and guess what has been happening in parallel? The drop of trust in leaders and the drop in employee engagement that we've been talking about in the conference yesterday. So what do? I think one of the big things that we need to do is really encourage research on what one of my colleagues, a professor at Harvard Business School named Julie Battilana, calls institutional entrepreneurs. People who create change within a context that has shaped their mindset such that they find that they will not challenge the assumptions of the system. And part of what's interesting here is that she has done a lot of work in the big, stodgy bureaucracies that most of us don't look at and don't spend time on. And what she finds is that the really divergent innovations, the ones that cut against the grain of our dominant assumptions, always come from left field, from the periphery, from the lower status groups. And so I think we should encourage much more of this kind of research and encourage really looking at this whole system, the business schools, the research, what the media points to, what's happening in organizations, the role models, really as an ecosystem if we are to change the way we think about management so that it is more useful across the board. Thank you.